All right, good afternoon. My name is Michael Halpern. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Welcome to this virtual public hearing hosted by the Union of Concerned Scientists on the Environmental Protection Agency's proposed supplemental rule titled Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science. This session is being recorded and should post to the UCS YouTube page shortly after it ends. We do appreciate you taking the time to provide public comments on the proposed supplemental rule. Close to 100 people registered to provide public comment at the 3 sessions today. We're going to begin hearing public comments shortly at this third of 3 sessions. And we do have a little bit of space at the end. So if you would like to register to speak at the end of the session, please email ucsvph@gmail.com as quickly as you can. That's ucsvph@gmail.com. Before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Ken Kimmel, President of the Union of Concerned Scientists, for some opening remarks. Ken, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
Great. And you can see me as well?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. But we're here for the wrong reason. We're here because the EPA, which is supposed to hold a public hearing on a matter of great importance, including one like this, has refused to do so. I have to tell you, it's very unusual that a non-governmental organization is in the position where it needs to sponsor a public hearing on a proposal by a federal agency. Typically, federal agencies do that work. But that being said, I'm glad we're all here. This is an important day for science. It's also an important day for democracy. Interest in the proposal that we're going to talk about today is very strong. The initial iteration of this rule received more than 600,000 public comments over a 3.5-month timeframe. The supplemental rule, which we will talk about today, significantly changes the initial proposal, but yet the opportunity for public input on it is currently severely limited, especially when one considers just how sweeping this proposal is and how different it is from the original proposal. For this proposal, the EPA originally provided a 30-day window for public comments with no public hearings. Now, EPA recently extended the public window to 60 days with a deadline of May 18th, but still with no public hearing, which is just grossly insufficient. During normal times, the government recommends a minimum 60-day public comment for the simplest of proposals. But these are not normal times, and this is not a simple proposal. Numerous science and public health organizations, including the Union of Concerned Scientists, urge the EPA to extend the public comment period to at least run 30 days beyond the end of the declared national public health emergency. We also asked for virtual public hearings. Unfortunately, EPA refused both of those requests, so we decided to hold this hearing on our own. We invited EPA to send staff today to listen to today's hearing and ask questions. They declined to do that also. Now, the COVID-19 crisis has caused profound challenges to our country and our communities in the world. The virus has disrupted all of our lives. Many people are working remotely while caring for children who are out of school. Others are taking on the crisis directly and working extra hours at great risk, from healthcare specialists to sanitation workers. Public health organizations are working overtime to provide scientific advice to protect individuals and communities throughout the country. Some people have reduced access to technology. So all of these conditions make it more difficult for public comment. So that's why it is enormously impressive to me that more than 100 people have registered to speak today. This is a testament to how many people realize the significance of this proposal to EPA's ability to meet its mission and protect public health and the environment. We heard from many more who didn't have the bandwidth to provide comprehensive feedback on the proposal today due to other commitments created by the pandemic. Now, today's public hearing, of course, is not the only opportunity to provide public comment. So I encourage everyone to develop written comments to respond directly to the proposal. The Union of Concerned Scientists has developed a guide to providing effective public comments on this rule on its website. Now, we expect the EPA to do its job and seek feedback on proposals, but when the agency fails, as is the case today, we will step in to make sure that the agency receives as much feedback as possible. And all of us look forward to reviewing the public comments that are made today. So before I turn this back over to Michael, I want to leave with this framing question. I think we all know, especially in the light of the crisis that we're in right now, that having the best science, the best data, the best analysis before governmental decision makers is not only important, it is literally a matter of life and death. So I hope and I trust that the comments today will shed light on this crucial question. Does the EPA's proposal advance this imperative of having the best available science, or does it undermine it? And with that framing question, I'd like to turn this back to Michael.
Thank you, Ken, for those remarks. And I'd like to provide everybody with some background information and briefly describe the proposed rule on which we are taking comments today. So the EPA describes the rule as follows. The supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking proposes that the scope of the rulemaking apply to influential scientific information, as well as significant regulatory decisions. This notice proposes definitions and clarifies that the proposed rulemaking applies to data and models underlying both pivotal science and pivotal regulatory science. In this SNPRM, EPA is also proposing a modified approach to the public availability provisions for data and models that would underlie significant regulatory decisions and an alternate approach. Finally, EPA is taking comment on whether to use its housekeeping authority independently or in conjunction with appropriate environmental statutory provisions as authority for taking this action. So for both oral and written comments, EPA will only consider feedback that directly addresses this supplemental proposal. So please do your best today to speak to the changes to the rule that are made in the supplemental proposal and its impact on EPA's ability to complete its mission and protect public health and the environment. So today's hearing is going to work as follows. Members of the public pre-registered to speak and were assigned a speaking time. They were asked to sign in on the webinar at least 20 minutes before their scheduled time in case we run ahead of schedule or in case different speakers cannot make it today. We're here today to hear comments on that proposed supplemental rule. We will not be able to respond to questions from attendees or have any dialogue among speakers. And in order to accommodate all speakers, testimony is limited to 4 minutes. After your name is called, we will ask you to proceed with your testimony. A transcript from this public hearing will be submitted to the docket, and a recording will be made publicly available. If you have any written comments or other documents you would like to submit for the record, including your testimony as prepared for delivery, please email them to the email address you received on your confirmation form, which is ucsvph@gmail.com. That's ucsvph@gmail.com. If you're watching this broadcast, you can also register again to speak today by emailing ucsvph@gmail.com as quickly as possible, and we will do our best to add you to the queue. We will also make our best effort to ensure that any comments spoken in languages other than English will be translated into English in the written transcript. If you have additional comments after today, please follow the instructions on the Federal Register notice for this proposal and submit those comments by May 18th, 2020. Again, UCS has provided a guide for people on making effective comments on this proposal on the UCS website. Today's hearing is broken into three separate sections. The first one began at 9 a.m. this morning, the second one at 1 p.m. this afternoon, and this one at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Each session is being streamed live through the Union of Concerned Scientists YouTube channel and can also be viewed on the UCS website. And finally, we ask for your patience with this virtual hearing. People will have varying internet bandwidths and familiarity with the technology and experience providing testimony. If someone has technical difficulties when it is their turn, we will move on to the next speaker and return to the person with technical difficulties later in the session. All right, with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to turn it over to Jason Jacobson, who's going to be running today's hearing. Jason?
Thank you, Michael. As a reminder, all attendees are muted automatically. We will unmute you when it is your turn to speak. If you wish to turn on your video, you may do so. We will now begin our public comments. The first speaker will be Hayden Hashimoto, followed by Dr. Lisa Patel, and after that, we will hear from Kyla Bennett. Hayden Hashimoto, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Hayden Hashimoto, and I am an attorney and legal fellow with Clean Air Task Force. CATF seeks to protect public health and the environment from the impacts of harmful air pollution through research, analysis, and public advocacy. US EPA's supplemental notice contravenes the agency's mission to protect human health and the environment. This unlawful effort to tie the agency's hands behind its back limits its ability to consider the best available science in making regulatory decisions that affect public health and inserts politically motivated considerations into the decision-making process. While couched as an effort to improve transparency, EPA provides little to no explanation as to how either the former proposed rule or this supplement would actually achieve that goal. EPA fails to show why the current process for considering available cutting-edge science, including relying on currently available peer review for influential scientific information, is problematic. EPA's argument about transparency does not hold water and certainly does not justify a drastic restriction on the agency's statutory duty to promote public health by taking a forward science-based approach in decision-making. The idea promoted by EPA that peer-reviewed research based on confidential personal human health data is inherently suspect has no scientific basis. Any rule intended to encourage or pressure researchers not to guarantee the confidentiality of personal data or that would undermine potential subjects' willingness to participate in studies is likely to create significant impediments to future research. EPA's proposal forces health researchers to decide between ignoring federal privacy requirements that protect the confidentiality of the human subjects of scientific study or producing health studies that will be ignored because they don't satisfy EPA's new standard. EPA has not provided a single compelling reason to explain why this kind of negative impact on public health research would further its statutory mission or otherwise be warranted. EPA's reliance on its supposed housekeeping statute authority for this rule is particularly problematic. As an initial matter, because EPA is not listed in the law as an executive department, the statute does not directly grant any authority to EPA. And even if it did apply to EPA, this proposal is simply not a rational or reasonable exercise of that authority. That's because the statute provides authority for rules of practice or procedure, not those that affect the substantive outcome of a federal regulation. While EPA tries to claim that this is a procedural rule, the substantive impact of this rule is clear. Denying access to the best science will have a substantive effect on federal public health regulations by removing support for more health protective rules. Indeed, the fact that the original proposal, which EPA is reporting now to supplement, was not described as procedural is very revealing. EPA well knows that its intention with its original proposal was to limit the access to significant scientific work based on human health data, because that work demands stronger regulatory actions. And this supplemental proposal expands that effort. This is an entirely outcome determinative effort to limit access to cutting edge science that explains the impacts of, among other things, exposure to air pollution and allows for its quantification in the name of transparency. The Supreme Court made clear in Chrysler Corporation v. Brown that the housekeeping statute cannot be used as authority for substantive regulations that limit the scope of another statute. Limiting the agency's ability to consider research that relies on confidential human health studies would impede environmental regulations under several statutes, not least of which is the Clean Air Act. For example, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards Program, the bedrock of our national clean air law, requires EPA to issue air quality criteria that accurately reflect the latest scientific knowledge useful in indicating the kind and extent of all identifiable effects on public health or welfare, which may be expected from the presence of such pollutant in the ambient air. This proposed rule directly undermines that directive. In sum, EPA has no legal authority to move forward with this rule, and indeed, by doing so, undermines the legal duties it does have under various environmental laws. Therefore, EPA should withdraw this rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayden Hashimoto. Next up, we have Dr. Lisa Patel.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can and see you. Thank you.
Great. So I'm Dr. Lisa Patel. I'm a former environmental scientist at the Environmental Protection Agency, advocacy and policy lead at the Sean Parker Center for Allergy and Asthma Research at Stanford University, and a physician. I work as a pediatric hospitalist who's on the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm here to testify because the EPA would in essence create its own avoidable health crisis by moving forward with the supplemental rule, which substantially limits science used to keep our children healthy. Rigorous scientific studies use patients or subjects in trials to study, measure, and track a variety of biomarkers and health outcomes due to environmental pollution. Researchers have an ethical directive to protect the identity of these patients by not disclosing their personal health information or PHI. The supplemental rule mandates that data used for its internal scientific assessments and rulemaking be publicly available, a logistical impossibility for studies using PHI. The EPA could essentially ignore these studies under the rule. I'd like to talk about what this means for air pollution and children's health in particular. New research shows us that pollutants like PM2.5 affect us down to our very genes, altering our epigenetic programming in ways that increase our risk for asthma and activate a pro-inflammatory cascade that places us at higher risk for a range of cardiopulmonary disease. This starts in utero, and data from our center shows that exposure to PM2.5 also changes epigenetic programming and immune regulation in young kids that are potentially heritable. What does this mean for health? Mothers exposed to higher levels of PM2.5 are at higher risk for giving birth to premature or low birth weight infants or for a stillbirth. Premature infants and low birth weight infants are at higher risk for death, neurological disability like cerebral palsy, and chronic pulmonary conditions. Children are particularly vulnerable to pollutants like PM2.5. They spend more time outside, have a faster respiratory rate compared to adults, which exposes them to more pollution. A majority of their lung maturity and growth occurs in the postnatal period, making them very susceptible to environmental toxins. In the short term, higher PM2.5 concentration results in higher number of emergency room visits for asthma and increased upper respiratory infections in children. In the long term, studies show that early and chronic exposure to air pollution places children at higher lifetime risk for developing asthma, hypertension, obesity, type 2 diabetes, dyslipidemia, and cardiac arrhythmias. This risk is not distributed evenly throughout our population, with marked disparities for Blacks regardless of poverty status. Our best available science is showing us that pollutants like PM2.5 are more dangerous than we previously knew at even lower levels than we previously understood. Data shows that even at the lowest detectable PM2.5 levels of 2.8 still result in an excess of 30,000 deaths per year. A study from Liu et al. Evaluating air pollution in 652 cities found that an increase in just 10 micrograms per meter cubed in a 2-day moving average was associated with 0.44% increase in daily all-cause mortality, 0.36% increase in daily cardiovascular mortality, 0.47% increase in daily respiratory mortality. When information from studies using PHI suggests we should be tightening our regulation, the EPA can easily ignore these studies to justify inaction or rollbacks that would worsen health outcomes. The COVID-19 pandemic shows us the newest threat to human health and why research, particularly on air pollution, matters. Data from Wu et al. This year shows us that for every 1 microgram per meter cube of PM2.5, there is a 15% increase in mortality from COVID-19. Researchers at our center are starting to look at factors and the associations that would rely on PHI to better understand this link. The EPA's rule would essentially quash this type of much needed research if there was no hope for it to be utilized to change policy. We've talked about the data, but I just want to take my last minute to talk about what this looks like as a practicing physician in a hospital. The terrified eyes of a child who is suffocating in front of you because of a severe asthma exacerbation, landing in an intensive care unit again for impending respiratory failure. The expectant mother, who the day before was preparing her nursery, now finds herself in premature labor, being told by a physician like myself about her infant's chance of survival without significant morbidity, the possibility of putting an endotracheal tube down her little baby's throat, of chest compressions, of a central line to keep her baby alive. We should do our all to prevent these outcomes, not increase their number. The EPA's rules have the ability to determine whether a child will live a long life of good health or a shortened life of disease and disability, and I urge the EPA to abandon this rule and continue to use the best available science to protect the health of our children.
Thank you, Dr. Lisa Patel. Next up, we'll hear from Kyla Bennett. And after Kyla Bennett, we'll hear from Roy Gamze. Kyla, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Kyla Bennett, and I am the Science Director for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER. I'm a former EPA employee where I worked as both a scientist and a lawyer. I want to thank USC for holding these virtual hearings and filling the void that Trump's EPA has created. PEER commented on the original rule in August of 2018, and this supplemental rule does not alleviate our concerns. In fact, it only serves to increase our concerns. The bottom line is that both the original rule and its supplemental are bad solutions searching for a problem that does not exist. This rule will impede both the speed and accuracy of EPA decision-making, something which is particularly important in times like these. EPA's core mission is to protect human health and the environment, and this supplemental rule will do the opposite. Our primary concerns are: 1, the federal housekeeping statute does not give authority for this rule. According to its legislative history, the housekeeping statute is never intended by Congress to authorize an agency to use it for substantive regulations. 2, expansion of the rule to cover all data, studies, and models, not just dose response models, is far too broad. This simply means that EPA will now have the ability to ignore far more science and research than it originally proposed. 3, consideration of studies only of the underlying if the underlying data is publicly available in a tiered access approach is still indefensible. The tiered access approach, by which data that cannot be made public can be shared with a few for independent validation, is still unworkable. It is illegal to share personal health data with anyone, so sharing it with just one or a handful of people is just as illegal as sharing it with the general public. Giving less consideration or no consideration to studies where underlying data are not publicly available is a political decision that has nothing to do with science. This is contrary to EPA's mission to protect human health and the environment based on best available science. 4, EPA does not have the resources to reanalyze all the data used in decision-making. The supplemental rule clarified that by saying all studies had to be reproducible, they meant reanalyzed. EPA does not have necessary statisticians and data analysts to do such work. Moreover, this will delay all EPA decision-making. When studies are sent to the FDA, statisticians do reanalyze all the data. Expedited FDA review takes roughly 6 months. Normal reviews can take up to 2 years. How will EPA deal with the lack of resources within the agency and the timing? How much will this cost, and what will delays mean in terms of impacts to human health and the environment? Here in the US, chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. In other words, new chemicals, such as novel PFAS, can be used unless and until they are proven to adversely affect human health and the environment. What will the human cost be to these delays? 5, this supplemental rule is simply a continuation of this administration's war on science. Peer review of scientific articles should be enough to establish the strength of a study. Scientists are able to evaluate the strength of a study by looking at the data transformation, sample size, assumptions, and the model. These safeguards already exist in peer review. This rule invents a new, arbitrary, and political standard by which a study is judged, unrelated to scientific merit. Moreover, given the EPA administrator, who is often not a scientist him or herself, and also a political appointee, giving them the authority to grant an exemption to the rule is pure politics. In conclusion, this rule purports to increase transparency and good science, but it does exactly the opposite. It allows the agency to substitute its political will in the place of science. EPA should withdraw the rule immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kyla Bennett. Next, we'll hear from Roy Gamze.
Thank you to UCS. I'm Roy Gamze. I was Deputy Assistant Administrator of EPA, responsible for overseeing the regulation development process. I'll start with what the supplement doesn't do. It doesn't provide any reason why this self-regulation is needed. No examples of EPA rules that are faulty because data or models aren't available to the public. It's based on a theory with no supporting evidence, which will result in very high implementation costs and likely lost health benefits to the public. EPA has not provided the costs for this rule. They're claiming that it's not a major rule costing at least $100 million a year as defined by the executive orders. But the Congressional Budget Office estimated a very, very similar House of Representatives proposal, the Secret Science Reform Act of 2015, would cost $250 million annually. So where's the economic impact analysis that's required of every other EPA action over $100 million, not in the supplement. What is in the supplement on pages 9 and 10 are two alternatives for dealing with studies for which data or models aren't available for independent validation. EPA asks, which do you prefer? A, tiered access used to reduce the risk of re-identification of private information, or B, the agency giving greater weight to studies where the underlying data and models are available than to those for which they are not. To understand the choice, consider the realities of anonymizing human health data. EPA says it can take a data set of personal health information obtained in research studies with the promise of confidentiality and disguise it so that individuals are anonymous. Sounds good, but no longer feasible in these days of big data analysis. The International Society of Environmental Epidemiologists submitted comments showing how weak the promise of anonymized confidentiality really is. They showed that in the Harvard 6-city study, most individuals in one of the cities could be identified without name and address information, but just the information needed for independent validation. For a Medicare cohort with exposures by zip code and the data needed for validation, most of the individuals who died would be identifiable. A peer-reviewed study looked at environmental health study in Northern California with data considered by HIPAA to be de-identified and identified 25% of the participants correctly. A study searched LexisNexis database for stories mentioning hospitalization and identified 43% of the patients without personal identification information provided. A National Academy of Sciences workshop reached the same conclusion. Attempts to anonymize health data would strip away information that identifies individuals, but leave enough for independent replication, still allow participants to be identified. EPA didn't address those ISEE comments in the supplement, and the alternatives it proposes don't solve the problem. EPA won't know if the anonymization will indeed protect confidentiality when an ISEE expert or a malicious hacker tries to crack it, so it cannot guarantee confidentiality, and it can only promise best efforts. Furthermore, future guarantees of confidentiality to research participants couldn't be honestly made. If you ask me if my son can participate in a study of lead exposure on intelligence and you offer me best efforts at keeping his information secret, my answer is no, and yours would be too. So getting participants in future environmental health studies will get much, much harder, if not impossible. What about alternative B, giving epidemiology studies for which personal data is not available a lower priority than other studies? If the epidemiology study is the best study, then it should have the most weight. It is immoral under EPA's governing legislative mandates to not use the best available science, especially due to a rule with no justification. Look at the track record of health studies used by EPA as a basis for its regulation and ask, how many would be given lower or no consideration? Why hasn't EPA answered that question? They may be reluctant to reveal the answer. Hence, we have no hard data or even estimates of the real world impact of the regulations, the proposed on regulations, health, or costs. So my answer to EPA's question, do you prefer alternative A or B, is a resounding neither. In conclusion, EPA demonstrated no need for this rule, no examples of what problem is being fixed, no examples of what studies would be downgraded and the effect of doing so, no examples of improperly justified rules, no cost despite the executive orders. It has incurred the derision of almost every reputable health and science organization, and EPA should stop wasting its time and our time on this unnecessary rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. At this time, we will take a short recess and we'll come back in 5 minutes to allow some additional speakers to join us in the hearing. Thanks. You're listening to public comments, and we will now hear from Diana Burdette. There you go, Diana.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm here on behalf of Lake County in Illinois, and I'm speaking for the community. I'm an organizer, an activist, and a mother, a concerned resident of this environmental justice community here in Lake County. I'm speaking from Waukegan, Illinois. And it is concerning that there are rollbacks regarding our environmental regulatory system, because I'm coming from a community where 1 child out of every 3 will end up in the hospital with respiratory issues. It's higher than the national average. And now we are in the middle of a pandemic which attacks our respiratory processes. So this rollback is asking us to disregard the science that will keep our community healthy and allow our respiratory systems to be attacked even further. We have no safeguards when we disregard science. And our lives are being touted, the lives of this community are being touted as essential lives. Our community provides essential workers, yet our day-to-day life isn't being respected. It's a shame when publicly we are told we're essential and we need to be out there and we need to be providing services for individuals who aren't able to come out and for individuals to stay home and be comfortable. And publicly, they give us cartoon figures with capes, but they don't even provide safeguards using our best science. And it's a problem to the future of our children, to the health of our essential workers who are out there on a regular basis, providing the services to the remaining of the communities around us, knowing full well that when we come out of this, we come out of it worse than when we entered. I am a mother. I have a 4- and a 6-year-old child. And my neighbor has a young 9-month-old, and my neighbor to my right has a 10, a 13, and a 16-year-old. We are a community with futures, and all we ask is that our science, our best science, isn't disregarded and thrown away. Our immune system is going to be left a wreck. And the last thing that we need is the coal plant deregulated that is a mile away from me. Is the ethylene oxide sterilizer deregulated that is 3 miles away from us? We've already experienced several chemical emergencies in this last year in 2019. Now we're dealing with a pandemic. And all of the essential workers in this area come from our community that is being ravaged. We are one of the highest hotspots in Illinois, aside from South Side Chicago. We need to enter the next year with stronger science and stronger regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Next, we have Dylan Burdette.
Hello.
Dylan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the Union of Concerned Scientists for taking on the responsibility of holding this public meeting while the decision makers at the EPA have shirked their responsibility to protect the most vulnerable populations in our country. I am sorry that I was not present to hear the earlier comments from today. I'm coming to this hearing directly from work. As a scientist whose primary research is currently pivoting in an attempt to create an effective therapeutic for the disease COVID-19 among the only to be brought back up as an amended rule. This is another example of the administration taking advantage of a bad situation in order to devalue and sideline science and put our people at risk, when our medical and scientific professionals are needed more than ever to protect and ensure the health of our population moving forward. This is a rule that should not apply to pivotal regulatory decisions, but also has no business being applied to influential scientific information. When considering any type of scientific information, the EPA must use the best science available. Due to the rules of most institutional review boards, or IRBs, this rule would sideline nearly all basic science research to date. Actual scientific analysis, allowing important studies to be devalued for mere political reasons. It would drastically decrease the amount of participants that would participate in research moving forward, as tests using the anonymization protocols suggested by the EPA have been shown to not protect the true anonymity of most research subjects. This could expose research subjects to potential retaliatory actions, employment problems, or unwanted press attention. This would also allow the elimination of long-standing and well-accepted studies, as the research subjects may have already passed away. This amended rule could potentially give the EPA administrator discretion regarding the data that the EPA can consider. I would like to be perfectly clear on this. The administrator of the EPA and their office should not in any situation be given the ability or authority to weigh in and decide which studies should be exempt from this rule and which studies would have this rule applied to them. Of the administrator for exemptions. This would create yet another unscientific tiered system by which scientists' findings could be used and abused after their creation. When we look at who will be most affected by this amended rule, it is once again the most vulnerable communities within our country. Fence line communities existing at the intersection of immigrant communities, communities of color, and working class communities are the ones who have suffered disproportionately under the administration's EPA's rule changes and rollbacks. This proposed rule change is no different. As a scientist and a member of a fence line community and an environmental justice community, I know that this rule will hurt our community disproportionately. We have already been struggling economically, and our people have been forgotten or ignored, as our elected representatives are more focused on their campaign contributions than the health of their most vulnerable residents. We need protection from corporations that see our lives merely as line items on a balance sheet. For all of these reasons, I implore the EPA to not adopt this rule, either in its amended or its original form. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. As a reminder, for all of the public comments that have been provided today, we will attempt to get written testimony supplements as well to ensure that if anyone did have their audio pause, we will capture the entirety of their remarks. We will now take a short break while we wait for other speakers to join, and we'll check back in every 5 minutes. Thank you. You are listening to public comments at a virtual public hearing regarding supplemental rule on EPA proposal, strengthening transparency and regulatory science, hosted by the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our next speaker will be Zygmunt Plotter. Zygmunt, you can go ahead when you're ready.
Good. Let me see.
We can hear and see you.
Good, marvelous. I'm Zygmunt Plotter. I have been a professor for more than 50 years on public health, administrative law, environmental protection law. And I want to say the practical effect of this proposed rule would clearly be to deter, to diminish, to prevent EPA from issuing strong public health and public safety protections. It's not just the likely effect, however, it also appears to be the likely intent of the agency's political leadership. It's a cynically clever trick. In court tests based on administrative law, EPA can't issue binding rules without a solid base in fact and science. And according to its statutes, EPA must issue protective rules when the facts and the science show potential threats to public health and safety. So the political leaders of EPA have come up with a way to avoid issuing strong protections, even when science shows a public threat. It's restrictive science. By adopting this policy here in this rule that says, even if the science isn't good, that science can't be used to regulate, EPA cannot be forced to regulate. So EPA says the supporting studies cannot be used unless there can be an intensive, independent validation down to the raw data of confidential information of all the human test subjects. But EPA knows that virtually all human subject studies ethically give their subjects strict confidentiality. So human studies used in all the most important EPA rulemaking cannot be used, and so the protective rules cannot be issued. So now look at this wording. independent validation. By whom? Not by EPA, not by science policy organizations. They don't have to look at confidential data. So the raw data, they say, has to be pryable apart down to individual personal identities so regulated industries can fight EPA on whatever rules EPA issues. So it's to facilitate attacks against their own EPA rules that EPA leaders either prevent the rules from being passed in the first place or facilitate the attacks on their own rules. It's clear to anyone who understands political realism watching this charade that the purpose of the proposed rule is to allow EPA to bypass its statutory duties. And the disingenuously entitled transparency rule is not just housekeeping. Housekeeping rules aren't allowed if they legally affect people external to the agency, and scientists external to the agency are affected in having their work embargoed and may violate their First Amendment right to petition the government. All this doesn't come to us from rational public administrative process. It does not come to us from science. It comes from what political scientists call agency capture, when agency officials aren't motivated by the public's welfare and health and safety, but rather by the interests of the very entities who they're supposed to regulate for the protection of the public. But this rule will be readily reversed when an administration oriented to public service comes to clean up this fetid mess. It would be nice to ask, please explain how this proposed rule can avoid the legal taint of a highly partisan regulatory agenda for cutting back on public protections that EPA is supposedly sworn to protect. There, I think I got it into 4 minutes. And as you can see, there are important problems with this rule. And most of them are that EPA is not serving EPA's purpose, but undercutting it. Over and out.
Thank you, Zygmunt.
Thank you.
This concludes the evening session. The recording of the session should be available on the YouTube page of the Union of Concerned Scientists shortly. Thank you again for your participation today.